So we know that for Elinor Ostrom, context really matters. And we've seen that her work has shown that given certain contextual features, we have the ability to craft institutions that sort of govern resources that we hold in common. And so, sort of the outcome of all that work is that the tragedy is by no means a foregone conclusion. And so I mentioned before that Ostrom's work certainly challenged standard ideas about rationality, and her inductive empirical approach isn't something you usually see in the economics literature either. But I have been a bit sneaky in sort of introducing these ideas by focusing on the game theory logic that still underpins Ostrom's arguments. Because while we might see Ostrom's work as quite different from the standard way of looking at things, but our ideas still really rest on a notion of rational individuals making cost-benefit analyses of whether it's worth it to invest in processes of institutional change or the building of these norms. So simply saying that context matters, but still insisting on methodological individualism, sort of that underpins the game theory logic that we've seen, I would say can be seen as a bit of an unsatisfactory approach, ontologically speaking. So remember, what we mean by methodological individualism is that we're really reducing these institutions that govern collective action to rational choice type explanations of the actions of individuals involved. And in this case, we kind of have the design principles or the objective context, and then out pop the institutions or not that structure the incentives for cooperation. So again, going back to that sort of causal arrow, that we have the design principles, the context, and it's that unidirection from these design principles to the institutions, to these norms of trust and reciprocity, and it's these that then structure the incentives for cooperation. So it's these norms of trust and reciprocity that are altering the game payoffs to move the game from a prisoner's dilemma to a coordination game. But it's quite reasonable to think instead that these types of institutions, these types of norms, are kind of more than a kind of framework for ordering actors who are pursuing their interests in a strategic kind of cost-benefit type way. And another perspective would really argue that these interests are socially constructed, not naturally derived, and that institutions of this type aren't really the result of pursuing apolitical interests, but they're actually these institutions themselves define what interests are, how they're acquired, and kind of how they're internalized. And likewise, if we're thinking about international relations, clearly historically specific structures of power rather than simply calculated payoffs, most probably underlie these norms and conventions of collective action on shared resources and global public goods. So these norms and conventions as institutions don't just manage the resource of good, they also kind of serve to reproduce the relations of dominance and dependence and really provide the context for international relations. And we're going to unpick the links between power and global public goods more in the seminar, but with these thoughts in mind, I'd like to look at some other points where the sort of rational institutional choice logic might break down at the global level.